In Stamps, Arkansas, the day does not arrive all at once. It seeps in, through the cracks around the door frame, through the thin glass of the front windows, already filmed with dust. The air is warm, even early on, holding the faint smell of earth and sun-heated wood. The store is awake before most of the town. Its shelves are close together, packed tight with tins and jars and folded sacks stacked low against the wall. The wood beneath the counter has been worn smooth by years of hands and elbows making acquaintance with the surface day after day, and lightly dented by the countless coins and heavy tins that have been counted and recounted. There's a sweetness in the air too, flour, sugar perhaps, coupled with something faintly medicinal and soap-like, intermittently taking control of the musty air. Near the back, a young girl sits. She keeps herself small, knees drawn in, shoes barely touching the floor. From where she is, she can see almost everything without being seen herself. The counter, the doorway, the thin strip of road beyond the glass. Each time the door opens, a small bell rings out, quick and bright. It cuts through the room, then fades, leaving behind the scrape of shoes on the floorboard and the low murmur of adult voices, lowering or lifting as needed. She observes those changes in tone and learns what they mean. The light inside the store is pale and uneven. Dust moves through it slowly, floating and landing again on the ancient surfaces. Nothing here is pristine. Everything is opaque and used. Brown paper, dull metal, labels faded by time and handling. Books, bulbous from crinkled pages. These books are close by. Their pages smell different from the rest of the room. Dry, yes, but fresh, untouched by the work of the day. They do not ask the girl to speak. Inside them, voices exist that do not demand anything back. People leave places like this and survive them, unlike much of what the town has to offer her. Outside, the town continues as it always has. The rhythms are known. The rules are unspoken but firmly kept. There are places where she can go and places where she cannot. Places where her presence is expected and places where it is barely tolerated. She notices this early on, as one would when dealing with such polarity. And through the years, the girl forms an understanding that observation can be a shelter, that stillness can be preparation, and that words, when they finally arrive, will matter. For now, though, she stays where she is, listening to the bell, watching the dust, and allowing the world to move around her untouched. Welcome to Sleepy Archives, a podcast where we travel through the lives of people who have helped shape the world as we know it today. Tonight's story takes us through the life of one of the most influential voices of the modern era. Together, we enter the world of Maya Angelou, a world marked by trauma, resilience, and an enduring sense of care. As we move through some of the darker chapters of recent history, we also observe the steady light of a woman who held space beyond quantifiable means, often with only a few careful words. This is the life of Maya Angelou. Maya Angelou was born Marguerite Annie Johnson in April of 1928 in St. Louis, Missouri. Her arrival into the world was unremarkable in the way many beginnings are. No ceremony, and no sense of what her life would hold. What followed, however, was movement and disruption, decisions made beyond her understanding. Her parents' marriage ended early, before Marguerite was old enough to form memories that stayed neatly in place. She and her older brother Bailey were put on a train alone and sent south. They carried small bags, their names written down for them. The destination was Stamps, in Arkansas, a place they did not know, to live with their grandmother. Stamps was not loud. It did not announce itself as a city or large town perhaps would. Life there followed patterns and traditions that had been laid down long before Marguerite arrived and would continue long after. The pace was slow but deliberate, often shaped by routine as opposed to choice. At the centre of those days stood the store. Owned and run by her grandmother, Annie Henderson, it was more than a business. It was a gathering place, a point of stability in a town where very little could be taken for granted. Marguerite spent hours there, seated quietly, watching the flow of people and transactions, those who lingered and those who hurried, those who spoke freely and those who did not. Annie Henderson was a commanding presence. She spoke carefully and expected the same in return. Her authority was earned and not offered lightly. In a place where danger often arrived without warning, her composure served as protection. From her grandmother, Marguerite learned that control could be subtle and that strength did not always raise its voice. At home, life followed similar lines. Rules were clear, praise was sparse. Emotions were not something to be performed openly, because safety could be found in the predictability of constant. In this household, silence was something that marked that constant, and Maya was taught it was not something to be unnecessarily filled. Books became something to accompany her in that quiet. Marguerite read with focus and devotion, giving loyalty to the stories that opened spaces the town could not provide. Through them, she encountered language that moved freely, crossing borders, cultures, and timelines. She absorbed these precious variations of rhythm and structure. Words became something private and dependable, something that did not shift beneath her feet. When Marguerite was 8 years old, she and Bailey were sent back north, this time to St. Louis, to reunite with their mother. The city felt different from Stamps in every way. Louder, closer, and less predictable. Rooms were smaller, the walls thinner. Conversations had sharper edges and faster rhythms. It was during this period that her life would be divided into the before and after. At 8 years old, Maya would experience SA by her mother's boyfriend, dissolving any safety, confidence, or autonomy a child may have developed thus far. The details would remain largely unspoken for years, but the impact settled deep and immediately. Adults intervened. There were questions, a legal proceeding. The process was reported as formal and brief. It resulted in the justice system failing yet another victim of SA. The man was jailed for a small amount of time after being sentenced for only a year. Shortly after his release, news came that the perpetrator had been unalived. A lot of speculation centered around who committed this act, with several reports and sources suggesting it was a vengeful hit in response to the attack on young Maya, but no one was ever formally charged. In later years, Maya would write with striking clarity about what followed inside her mind after she learned of her attacker's death. As a child, she did not process the event in legal terms or in the language of justice. She processed it through cause and effect. She had spoken. She had named what happened, and soon after, the man was no longer alive. To an 8-year-old, the sequence felt simple, linear. In I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, she explained that she believed her voice had carried a power it was never meant to hold. If her words could lead to such an event, then they were not safe to use. Speech became something dangerous. Silence, by contrast, felt controlled and safe. She did not announce this decision aloud. She simply stopped speaking. For nearly 5 years, Maya communicated only when absolutely necessary, and often not at all. Family members tried to coax her back into conversation. Teachers mistook her silence for limitation. But, internally, her mind remained active. She listened. She memorized. She observed with an intensity sharpened by stillness. In her memoir, she later reflected that she thought words were like guns. If spoken carelessly, they could wound. If released into the world, their impact could not be undone. And so she withheld them. Following the events in St. Louis, Maya returned to the relative safety of Stamps, Arkansas, once again living under her grandmother's roof. It was there that her silence settled fully into place. To many around her, the quiet seemed like damage. To Marguerite, though, it felt like protection. Her grandmother did not force her to speak. Discipline remained steady, expectations unchanged. Life continued in its familiar shape. The store opened each morning, the bell rang, customers came and went. Marguerite watched it all with the same attentive gaze, only now from behind an even thicker pane of glass. There was one adult who recognized something different in the quiet, sensing that the silence was not vacancy, but accumulation. She began encouraging Marguerite to read aloud in small, private settings, without performatives or pressure, but with patience. At first, the words emerged reluctantly, softly, as though testing the air. However, with time, they would carry much more than sound. Among the adults in Stamps, there was one woman who stood slightly apart. Bertha Flowers was a well-educated black woman in rural Arkansas during the 30s and 40s, which in itself carried weight. In a segregated southern town, education among black women was not common, and refinement was often read as resistance. She was known locally as a teacher and as a woman of culture. In I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, Maya Angelou describes her as the aristocrat of black stamps. In her intention, highlighting the extent of her intellectual and cultural wealth and the influence the Flowers name had in the local area. Mrs. Flowers represented a kind of internal black elite, void of the classic classist desire, but one of which that signalled education, poise, and access to literature. She was educated, refined, and deliberate in her speech. She dressed with care, gloves in the summer, hats angled just so. She did not rush her words, and she did not waste them either. To the children of the town, she represented something expansive, a glimpse of another way of being. Mrs. Flowers had acknowledged Marguerite as a child, withholding something, but rather than pressing her to speak, as previous adults had, Flowers invited her into her home. The invitation itself was meaningful. It suggested trust, but also implied expectation. Inside that house, the air was different, quieter, intentional perhaps. Mrs. Flowers offered tea and thin slices of cake. She handed Marguerite a book, and then she began to read aloud. Her voice was measured and musical, each word placed very carefully. Language, in her hands, did not feel dangerous. It felt shaped, directed, alive even. She explained something to Marguerite that no one had articulated to her before. The words on a page are only half alive. They must be spoken to fully exist. That language is meant to move through the body and not remain trapped in ink. For a child who believed her voice could cause harm, this was a radical idea. Mrs. Flowers did not demand an immediate response, but instead asked Marguerite to memorize a poem, to read it aloud privately, to begin slowly, returning sound to breath. The process was gradual. A line spoken softly in an empty room, a paragraph recited under her breath. Over time, speech re-entered her life as a considered tool. Marguerite did not forget what she believed about words. She simply learned to handle them differently. The girl, who once thought her voice carried destruction, began to understand that it could also carry beauty. By the time she entered her teenage years, she was speaking again. Carefully, selectively, yes, but with growing confidence. The silence had seemed to sharpen her intellect, and with Mrs. Flower's care, the foundation was now set. The language would not be casual in her hands. It would be deliberate and earned. By the time Marguerite entered her teenage years, the silence that had once defined her began to loosen its hold. The decision was made that she would leave Arkansas again, but this time for California. The move was not solely geographical. The West represented possibility in a way the South did not. The horizon felt wider, the rules less entrenched. She arrived in San Francisco during the early 40s, a city reshaped by wartime industry. Shipyards were busy, and the streets filled with workers. Music often drifted from open windows. The atmosphere carried urgency. For a young black girl raised in the rigid segregation of Arkansas, the city felt alive in a different register entirely. Racism had not disappeared, but she found it operated differently. There was movement, there were options. Marguerite enrolled at George Washington High School while also attending the California Labor School, where she studied drama and dance. Performance did not seem to frighten her. Years of internal rehearsal meant she had come to deeply understand rhythm in an instinctual way. The danger language once held had been relieved by precision and presence in her tone. She grew taller, more self-assured. Her voice deepened into something unmistakable. During this period, Marguerite became determined to assert control over her own path, deciding she wanted to work as a streetcar conductor, a position not held by black women at the time. Regardless, she pursued it relentlessly. Repeated applications, countless office visits, patience, and insistence were finally acknowledged when she was hired as the first black female streetcar conductor in San Francisco. An incredible achievement alone, but one that would surprisingly be less known when later recounting the accolades of Maya Angelou. The uniform was structured and formal. The cap fitted low. The coin changer rested at her hip. For a teenager, the symbolism was not abstract, it was very much tangible. Independence, however, came with complexity. At 17, curious and eager to understand her own body and adulthood, she initiated a brief encounter with a neighborhood boy. The result was pregnancy. Marguerite's pregnancy was said to be practical and immediate. Marguerite did not marry the young man, nor did she frame the experience as tragedy. In later reflections, she described the decision that led to her pregnancy as experimental, an attempt to understand her own adulthood on her own terms. What followed was intensely physical. Her body changed quickly, mirroring her world, narrowing and expanding simultaneously. She kept the pregnancy largely private through her final months of school, telling few people until concealment was no longer possible. There was no extended adolescent indulgence. Instead, calculation. How would she provide? Where would she live? Who would help? When Clyde was born in 1944, the delivery, much like her own, would not be marked by extravagance. It was direct and clinical, but highly transformative. She was 17 years old, holding an infant whose survival depended entirely on her capacity to remain steady. She would later describe looking at him with nothing but clarity. Whatever uncertainty had existed before seemed to compress into focus. There was now someone watching her, someone learning from her. The weight of that responsibility altered her posture. Clyde, whom the world would later know as Guy Johnson, became both the anchor and the propulsion that would allow her to thrive. After giving birth to her son, internal adjustments naturally began to unfold. Motherhood altered the scale of her ambitions, but it did not shrink them. If anything, it sharpened her sense of necessity. Stability was no longer individual, it had become generational. She worked where she could: cook, dancer, nightclub performer. The wartime economy offered irregular opportunities, and she took them. The stage, in particular, suited her. Movement had always been in her body, even during the years of silence. Now it had found a place to land. San Francisco's nightclub scene in the mid-40s was layered and electric. Jazz spilled from basements, sailors on leave crowded small tables, and smoke settled across the low ceilings. Marguerite began working in venues such as the Purple Onion and other North Beach clubs, absorbing the rhythms of live performance night after night. These were not grand theatres, but intimate rooms where audiences sat close enough to notice hesitation. She quickly learned that presence mattered as much as talent. Timing, stillness, the ability to hold a room without pleading for its attention. Calypso became a particular strength. She studied Caribbean rhythms carefully, understanding that the music carried both celebration and commentary. Her voice, deep and resonant, felt akin to the style. Although motherhood did not remove her from these spaces, it did somewhat complicate them. When she performed late, childcare, of course, had to be arranged. Money was always calculated precisely, and sleep rationed. There were periods when Clyde stayed with her mother so that Marguerite could work more consistently. There were other times when he travelled with her, particularly when her touring years began, moving between temporary apartments and borrowed rooms. Stability was improvised, but love was never not bountiful. In the early 1950s, after her success performing Calypso in the San Francisco scene, a touring company would notice her and invite her to travel with their production of Porgy and Bess, taking her outside of American borders for the first sustained period of her life. The tour moved through Europe, including Italy, France, and Yugoslavia, introducing her to audiences who approached Black American art with a different curiosity than what she had known at home. Although exoticism is a present and ongoing conversation of the current zeitgeist of today, we can acknowledge the nuance and complexity Miss Angelou's experience must have held for someone experiencing this in such intensity and newness at the time. Marguerite was navigating the experience of being seen not through the narrow lens of Southern segregation, but as an artist. She observed closely how Europeans spoke about Americans, how Black performers were received as representatives of something larger than themselves. For the first time, she experienced spaces where her race did not immediately dictate the terms of interaction. It did not erase prejudice, but it shifted its architecture, making way for a whole other host of problems, of course, but also opportunity and a level of perceptibility. Travel sharpened her political awareness long before she would formally enter activism. Distance from America offered perspective, and Europe provided that distance. During portions of the tour, Clyde remained in the US under the care of family. The logistics of international travel with a young child were prohibitive, and a sacrifice of closeness for stability was often required. The arrangement was practical, but of course emotionally complex. Letters were always being written, money being sent home. Each return was said to carry both relief and adjustment for both mother and son. It was during this era that she adopted the name the world would come to know. Maya had long been her brother Bailey's affectionate nickname for her. Angelou was an adaptation from the surname of a Greek sailor she briefly married, Anastasios Angelopoulos. Anastasios Angelopoulos was a Greek sailor she met during this period of performance and travel. Their relationship was brief and by most accounts, impulsive. He brought with him a sense of foreignness that mirrored her own expanding world. The marriage did not endure, but it marked a transitional moment. From his surname, she crafted Angelou, a name softened and stylized for the stage. It was not merely an adoption, it was an adaptation, a deliberate shaping of identity. Names, to her, were not casual. Together, these names formed a persona that could stand independently of Marguerite Annie Johnson, the girl from Stamps. The marriage ended quietly, without hostility, only recognition that they were moving in different directions. By then, she had begun to understand that reinvention did not require permanence, it required courage. By the mid-50s, Maya Angelou had returned to the United States with more than stage experience. Europe had given her distance from the country that had sculpted her. Travel had complicated her understanding of race, nationality, and representation. The dubiety of her perceived identity was something that became difficult to ignore upon returning from a continent that had allowed Maya to move through society as artist first and foremost. In the late 50s, Miss Angelou moved from San Francisco, the city that had given her independence and autonomy, to New York City, a place that would allow her to grow further into her true self. Harlem, at the time, was not merely a neighborhood, it was an intellectual and political current. Musicians, writers, organizers, and thinkers moved through apartments and cafes with a propelling and hopeful energy. Conversations, debates, and creation stretched late into the night, entwining art and activism further into a shared discipline. She became connected with the Harlem Writers Guild, founded by the novelist John Oliver Killens. Killens was disciplined, direct, and uncompromising about the craft. John Oliver Killens had been born in Georgia in 1916 and raised in a household where storytelling was inheritance. His mother encouraged him to document what he witnessed. His father insisted that history, particularly Black history, must be preserved through honest record. By the time he arrived in Harlem, Killens carried both Southern memory and Northern urgency. He had served in the United States Army during the Second World War, an experience that had sharpened his understanding of institutional hypocrisy. A nation asking Black men to fight for democracy abroad while denying it at home was a contradiction he intended to document. His debut novel, Young Blood, published in 1954, examined the realities of racial terror and economic oppression in the American South with unsentimental precision. It refused to romanticize struggle. His later works, including And Then We Heard the Thunder, published in 1963, would continue to analyze and critique race, patriotism, and identity. In 1950, he founded the Harlem Writers Guild. The purpose was structured fellowship. He believed Black writers needed disciplined spaces and mentors, environments where their work could be challenged, encouraged, and debated with the weight it deserved, void of dismissal, exoticism, or dilution. Meetings were rigorous. Pages were read aloud and discussed directly. Weaknesses were named. Sentimentality was cut. Craft was nurtured with honesty, but also with rigor. For Maya, this environment was transformative. Killens did not see her as a nightclub performer dabbling in writing, but someone with infinite potential, and insisted that she treat it as a labor. He encouraged her to move beyond anecdote and into composition, to consider pacing, character, restraint. The guild positioned her within a lineage. Writing became communal and therefore accountable. In many ways, Killens helped shift Maya Angelou from performer to author. It was also during this period that Miss Angelou's political awareness began to formalize. She became involved with the Harlem branch of the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, one of the central civil rights organizations of the era. She would organize and attend fundraising events, lead meetings, and deliver speeches publicly and strategically utilizing a voice that had once been withheld for years. In the late 50s, Miss Angelou traveled across the country as Northern Coordinator for CORE, helping to raise money and awareness for the movement. The work required stamina due to the constant travel and mental navigation of a politically unstable climate. Despite the mentally and physically exhaustive nature of her role, Miss Angelou's artistic life did not dissolve during this time. Maya Angelou would record and release her first album, Miss Calypso, bringing her stage presence into recorded form. Miss Calypso was released in 1957 through Liberty Records. The record was recorded in LA at a moment when calypso music was experiencing a surge in popularity in the US, largely due to the crossover success of artists like Harry Belafonte. The album positioned her not as a novelty act, but as a serious performer of Caribbean-influenced folk music. Backed by a small ensemble of session musicians, guitar, percussion, bass, and light brass, the arrangements were restrained, allowing her voice to lead. Her vocal delivery on Miss Calypso was measured and deliberate. She did not rush lyrics for theatrical effect. Instead, she leaned into the art of phrasing, allowing each line to land with impact. The record included songs such as Stone Cold Dead in the Market, a playful yet rhythmically tight duet originally popularized by Belafonte and other calypso standards that blended humor with social commentary. Commercially, the album did not become a breakout success, but it was well received within the folk and nightclub circuits. Critics noted her presence more than her range. She was described, rather than ornamental, as many recording artists of the time would come to be. Television followed. During the late 50s, Maya Angelou would appear on a number of variety and liberal arts cultural programs, including appearances connected to the off-Broadway revue Calypso Heatwave, which she had helped bring to the stage. The production itself ran for over a year and positioned her at the center of New York's folk revival moment. Television in that era was tightly structured and often limiting for Black performers. Appearances were brief and performances were curated. Yet Miss Angelou used the format strategically, of course. The camera suited her stoic composure. One anecdote, often recounted from this period, involves producers attempting to encourage broader theatricality, more exaggerated movement, more smile. But she resisted. Her performance style was already deliberate, perhaps ahead of her time. Miss Angelou would demonstrate that stillness could hold a lens more effectively than excess. These appearances expanded her visibility, but they also exposed her to the mechanics of media, how artists were framed, how they were edited and then marketed, no different from a product. Though she was building recognition as a performer, something in her was shifting towards authorship. The album and television work demonstrated her versatility, but they also revealed the limitations of solely remaining in performance. Yes, the stage had given her audience, but it became clear writing could offer permanence. Amongst the widening success of both Miss Angelou's creative and political work, she was still learning to navigate these multiple identities alongside motherhood. Clyde, growing into adolescence, remained central. Their relationship was close and candid. She did not shield him from political conversation. The home was an extension of the movement. In 1960, her path crossed with that of Martin Luther King Jr. She had already been active in organizing spaces that intersected with his work. King recognized her capacity as someone who could mobilize. This reputation would travel, and Maya Angelou quickly rose to an honourable name within the political space. Miss Angelou's next milestone in this realm was her contribution to organising a benefit called the Cabaret for Freedom in New York to raise funds for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The event drew artists, intellectuals, and activists into one room. The relationship between art and activism was becoming ever more entwined, both in her personal world and the political sphere. Around this time, she entered into a relationship with South African freedom fighter Fusumzi Mackay. Mackay was a member of the Pan-Africanist Congress, living in exile due to apartheid. Their relationship would carry her beyond American borders once more, this time to the African continent itself. By 1961, she and Clyde relocated to Cairo in Egypt. The move was bold, financially uncertain, and above all else, politically charged. She accepted a position as associate editor of the Arab Observer, an English language news publication. The role marked another reinvention, from performer to journalist. Cairo expanded her worldview again. She lived among diplomats, exiles, intellectuals, and revolutionaries. Conversations were now international, and the contemporary critique of colonialism was no longer theoretical, but demonstrative. Her relationship with Fusumzi Mackay did not endure. Ideological differences and personal incompatibilities surfaced. Eventually, she and Clyde relocated again, but this time to Ghana. In Accra, she joined a community of African American expatriates that included scholars, writers, and political thinkers who had chosen to live in post-independence Africa. Ghana, newly liberated from British rule, represented possibility on an international scale. She worked at the University of Ghana, wrote for publications, and immersed herself in Pan-African thought. The years in Ghana were formative and sharpened her political vocabulary. They deepened her understanding of diaspora, the layered experience of being both American and African descended. Accra, in the early 60s, carried a particular kind of brightness. Ghana had gained independence from British rule in 1957 under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah. The air felt charged with possibility. Streets were busy, not only with commerce, but with conversation. Independence was no longer an abstract concept, and the building of a fresh nation detached from the confinement of colonial oppression was in full swing. During this time, a wave of African American expatriates, often referred to as the revolutionist returnees, were relocating from America to West Africa, creating a community of cultural, political, and intellectual figureheads that would later transfer this energy of revolution through their work back into the political movements home in America, Maya Angelou included. These scholars, Writers, journalists, activists, musicians had all come to Ghana seeking something that the US had not provided. In short, existence untethered from daily racial hostility. Among them were figureheads such as Julian Mayfield and W.E.B. Du Bois, who had both relocated to Ghana later in their lives. Conversations moved easily between continents. Colonial histories were compared. The civil rights movement in America was discussed alongside liberation movements unfolding across Africa. Evenings often unfolded in living rooms dense with cigarette smoke and debate. The distance from a dense and complex racial climate in America gave these revolutionaries space to think, to analyze, and process without the impending feeling of discrimination. The safety to explore these ideas in a newly independent African country was an energy impossible to recreate. Pan-Africanism was being lived, tested, and refined. There was an excitement in these rooms, a sense that history could be bent by coordinated thought. For Clyde, Ghana was both adventure and disruption. As a teenager, he attended school locally and adapted quickly in some ways. He was athletic and socially agile, forming friendships with Ghanaian students and other expat children. The absence of American racial hierarchies in their familiar form was noticeable. He was not read first as a problem, nor as a novelty. He was simply another boy navigating adolescence. But identity is complex. There were moments when Clyde felt the tension of in-betweenness, not fully Ghanaian, no longer entirely American in the way he had been. He experienced both welcome and scrutiny. His independence grew in Ghana, sometimes in ways that unsettled his mother. One frequently recounted episode from this period involved a serious car accident Clyde suffered whilst living in Ghana. The incident was sudden and severe enough that Miss Angelou had feared for his life. Sitting at his hospital bedside, the fragility of everything she had constructed became immediate. Political theory receded for the moment, and motherhood took centre stage. He survived. The recovery was steady, but the event sharpened her awareness that even in a nation alive with possibility, vulnerability always followed. Still, Ghana left its mark on them both. For Maya Angelou, it provided proximity to Africa, not as an ancestral abstraction, but as a lived environment. The smells of open markets, the rhythm of high-life music, the cadence of Twi spoken in markets and classrooms. She walked streets that did not treat her blackness as an anomaly. That shift alone was profound. Yet she also recognized she was American. Her speech carried it. Her cultural reflexes revealed it. Ghana offered belonging, but not erasure of origin. The years there intensified her understanding of diaspora. She was no longer moving simply in search of opportunity, but in search of alignment. It was in Ghana in 1964 that she met Malcolm X during his visit to Africa. Their conversation would alter her trajectory once again. Malcolm X, in the midst of reshaping his own ideology after leaving the Nation of Islam, was building an internationalist framework for Black liberation. He invited her to return to the United States to help organize the Organization of Afro-American Unity. She agreed. The decision marked the end of her extended years abroad. By the time she prepared to leave Ghana, she was no longer simply a performer or young mother navigating survival. She had become an organizer, a writer, and a woman comfortable in political spaces. When Maya Angelou agreed to return to the United States in 1964 at the invitation of Malcolm X, She was not returning as the young woman who had once left. She came back sharpened. The stage had trained her voice. Harlem had trained her discipline as a writer. Cairo exposed her to post-colonial journalism, and Ghana had given her intellectual grounding in Pan-African thought. She was no longer experimenting with identity, but inhabiting an established sense of self. Malcolm X, at this stage, was himself in transition. Having left the Nation of Islam, he had completed his pilgrimage to Mecca and returned with an expanded political vision. His rhetoric had evolved from separatist nationalism toward an international human rights framework. He was building the Organization of Afro-American Unity, modelled in part after the Organization of African Unity, with the aim of linking the Black American struggle to global anti-colonial movements. He needed organizers and strategists, people who understood both performance and persuasion. Miss Angelou agreed to help build the organization. She returned to New York prepared to work, but the timing was merciless. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem while preparing to address a crowd. He was only 39 years old. The organization Maya Angelou had agreed to help build was still in its infancy, its structure incomplete. His death did not simply halt a project, it destabilized it entirely. For Maya Angelou, the loss was both political and personal. She had recognized in Malcolm a kind of intellectual restlessness she understood, a refusal to remain fixed in one ideological shape. His death reinforced something she had already begun to experience repeatedly: the precarity of Black leadership in America. In the years that followed, she reconnected with Martin Luther King Jr. and deepened her involvement with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. If Malcolm had represented internationalist fire, King embodied strategic discipline. His philosophy of non-violence required stamina, composure, and long-term moral framing. Maya helped organize fundraising events and cultural programming to support SCLC's initiatives. She understood that cultural movements required money as much as rhetoric. Cabarets, readings, performances, she bridged art and infrastructure. But history was not finished taking. On the 4th of April, 1968, her 40th birthday, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. The date carved itself into her life permanently. For years afterwards, she would not celebrate her birthday. Friends would send flowers. She would remain quiet. 2 men, 2 movements, 2 assassinations within 3 years. The repetition was cumulative and heavy. There is a particular exhaustion that follows when hope is repeatedly interrupted. The late 60s in America were already dense with unrest, uprisings in urban centers, the Vietnam War escalating, trust in institutions eroding. For Maya, the losses of Malcolm and King narrowed something inside of her. She withdrew from public organizing for a period to reorientate herself and process the losses. It was during this time that a friend, the novelist James Baldwin, played a quiet but decisive role. Baldwin had long admired her voice and her intelligence. He understood her capacity for narrative. In conversations between them, he encouraged her to consider writing her story, a testimonial of sorts. There was resistance at first, Autobiography was not widely respected as serious literature at the time, particularly not from a black woman. Publishers were skeptical. The market was narrow, but an editor at Random House, Robert Loomis, challenged her directly. He suggested she attempt to write a memoir that would stand as literature rather than confession. The suggestion lingered. Miss Angelou had spent decades moving between countries, between disciplines and identities. She had lived through silence, performance, exile, organizing, motherhood, and loss. She had witnessed the architecture of movements from both stage and meeting room. Memory, she began to realize, was not indulgence. This was an archive. She began writing what would become I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. The manuscript did not move chronologically through her entire life. It returned instead to stamps, to childhood, to silence, to her grandmother's store, to the violation that altered her voice, to Mrs. Flowers, to the shaping of self before the shaping of politics. In choosing to begin there, she was making a structural argument that the personal precedes the public, that trauma and literacy are not separate histories. When I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings was published in 1969, it did not slip quietly into the literary landscape. It completely disrupted it. The book was direct about childhood violation, racism, displacement, and Black Southern life. It refused sanitization, whilst also refusing despair. Critics recognized its craft. Readers recognized its honesty. For many Black women, it offered recognition rarely granted in mainstream publishing. The girl who had once believed her voice could cause death had written a book that insisted voice could actually preserve life. When I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings was published in 1969, it entered an America that was already raw. The civil rights movement had lost two of its most visible leaders. Cities were unsettled. Campuses were volatile. The Vietnam War continued to escalate. Trust in institutions, political, legal, religious, was eroding. Into this atmosphere came a book that did not shout, but spoke with a needed directness. Maya Angelou had written a memoir that refused spectacle. The prose was controlled, the structure deliberate. Her childhood was rendered without sentiment. She did not dilute the violation she experienced, nor inflate it. The racism of stamps was described with precision, void of embellishment. Critics immediately recognized the craft. The New York Times praised the work for its lyricism and restraint. Reviewers noted that Angelou had managed something rare, a memoir that read with the narrative propulsion of a novel while retaining emotional honesty. She was not framed merely as an activist who had written a book. She had been introduced to the world as a writer. That distinction mattered greatly. For Black readers, particularly Black women, the response carried a different resonance. Letters arrived describing recognition. The Southern Black girlhood she depicted, the store, the church, the coded social rules, had rarely been documented with such clarity in mainstream publishing. Her voice did not explain Black life from the lens of white comfort. It had been articulated from lived experience and provided the nuance, observation, and representation media had been missing. However, at the same time, the book unsettled gatekeepers. Its candid discussion around themes of childhood essay, racism, and bodily experience made it a frequent target for bans in schools and libraries. In the years following publication, Caged Bird would become one of the most challenged books in American classrooms. Objections were often framed around explicit content, though the language itself remained measured. What disturbed critics was not the graphic detail, it was the candor in which it had been told. The controversy paradoxically expanded the book's reach. Teachers quietly assigned it. Students passed copies between one another. It became a text often encountered in adolescence, a moment when identity is already unstable. For many young readers, particularly young Black girls, it offered articulation for feelings that had not yet found language. Miss Angelou understood the significance of the reception. She had not written the book to provoke, yet the public response confirmed something essential. The private, when shaped carefully, could become collective. The success of Caged Bird created expectation. Publishers wanted more. Readers wanted continuation. The memoir had ended not at triumph, but at adolescence, just as her voice began to return. There was narrative space remaining, and so she faced a choice. She could allow the book to stand alone, a singular act of testimony, or she could expand the form. She chose expansion. Over the next decades, she would write a series of autobiographical volumes that traced her life in segments rather than sweeping summary. Gather Together in My Name would explore her late teenage years and early motherhood. Singin' and Swingin' and Getting Merry Like Christmas would chronicle her touring life and artistic development. Each volume refused the conventional arc of redemption. Instead, they documented process, mistakes, reinventions, contradictions. By structuring her life as a series rather than a single narrative, she made a quiet argument about identity, that it is iterative, that becoming does not conclude neatly. Academia began to take notice too. Universities invited her to speak, not as a celebrity, but as a thinker. Her lectures blended anecdote with analysis, humour with critique. She did not read from notes, but performed from memory. Students remarked on her cadence, the way she allowed silence to punctuate meaning, yet she resisted the title of professor. She had not completed a traditional university degree. Her authority was experiential and literary, not institutional. That tension became part of her presence. She stood at podiums as someone who had constructed knowledge outside of formal structures. However, the ban would continue. By the mid-70s, Caged Bird was appearing on lists of frequently challenged books. Some school boards attempted removal. Others defended it as essential reading. The debates often exposed deeper anxieties about whose stories were considered appropriate for public education. Angelou responded without defensiveness. She maintained that young people were capable of complexity, that shielding them from the truth did not protect them. Through all of this, she continued writing. Poetry collections followed, essays, screenwriting. Her language remained grounded in memory, but her scope widened. She was no longer simply recounting childhood, but positioning Black womanhood within American literature. By the early 70s, Maya Angelou was no longer introduced cautiously. She was being read, taught, debated. The success of I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings had opened a literary door, but she did not remain inside a single form. She moved laterally. In 1972, she wrote the screenplay for Georgia, Georgia, becoming the first widely known Black woman to have produced a feature film screenplay. The film, directed by Stig Bjorkman and shot in Sweden, followed an African American singer navigating interracial relationships, and expatriate life in Europe. The themes were not unfamiliar: displacement, visibility, desire, autonomy. But the medium required compression. Film demanded dialogue that could survive performance. The industry was not immediately accommodating. Hollywood did not open its gates because of one screenplay, but the fact of its production marked something. Her voice was no longer confined only to memoir. She returned to poetry with renewed urgency. Collections such as Just Give Me a Cool Drink of Water 'Fore I Die were nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. The poems were constructed without obscurity or the abstract and focused on accessibility, political themes, and rhythm. She wrote about Black love, survival, humour, labour. Her language carried the cadence of speech without sacrificing structure. Public readings became events. She did not stand stiffly behind the lecterns, instead, occupying stages with her whole being. The training from decades earlier never left her. She understood pause, breath, the weight of a held silence before the next line. Audiences responded not just to what she wrote, but to how she delivered it. At the same time, she continued expanding the autobiographical project. In addition to the previously mentioned works, The Heart of a Woman would later document her political work in years abroad. Each volume resisted simplification. She did not smooth her own contradictions. Financial instability appeared on the page, romantic misjudgments, professional insecurity. She documented reinvention without pretending it had been seamless. This refusal to polish her own narrative distinguished her from many public figures of the time. The memoirs did not read as curated legacy. They read as process, something everyone could relate to. Meanwhile, the classroom debates around Caged Bird continued. School boards challenged it, librarians defended it, but students kept reading it. Miss Angelou's response to censorship was measured. She spoke often about the intelligence of young readers. She argued that shielding them from complexity did not preserve innocence, it merely delayed understanding. By the late 70s, her presence in American culture had become multidimensional. She was a writer, poet, screenwriter, lecturer, and public intellectual. She appeared on talk shows and panel discussions, her composure steady and her diction unhurried. The camera continued to suit her. She resisted being framed solely as a Black writer, though she never distanced herself from Black experience. She resisted being reduced to activist, though politics remained embedded in her language. She moved between labels without settling. In 1981, she accepted a lifetime appointment as the Reynolds Professor of American Studies at Wake Forest University. The title was honorary in origin. She did not hold a doctorate, but the institution recognized her as authority. As cultural and literary. She would teach there for decades, shaping students through lecture rather than rigid syllabus. Her son, Clyde, now Guy, had grown into adulthood, navigating his own path in journalism and public service. Their relationship matured alongside her career. They spoke candidly, like they always had. They disagreed, but remained tethered. The rhythm of her life had become somewhat settled into a cadence, writing in the mornings and lectures scheduled months in advance. Travel interspersed with periods of domestic stillness. Visitors arriving at her home, students seeking counsel, and young writers asking for endorsement. She didn't retreat from public life, but she no longer chased it either. The work continued to deepen and expand. By the 80s and into the 90s, Maya Angelou was no longer entering rooms as a newcomer. She was being invited in as an institution. Television had changed since her early variety show appearances. The medium had widened. Daytime talk shows, long form interviews, cultural programming. These platforms now allowed for real, unscripted conversation and discussion. Miss Angelou, of course, adapted easily. Her relationship with Oprah Winfrey became one of the most visible cultural connections of this period. Oprah had first encountered I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings as a teenager and often spoke about its impact on her. When the two women appeared together publicly, their exchanges carried familiarity. Filled with warmth, humour, and directness, on The Oprah Winfrey Show, she discussed trauma, forgiveness, resilience, and self respect in a language that felt accessible without being simplified. The conversations were grounded in lived experience, and viewers began to see her as a voice of counsel. Her presence expanded beyond interviews. She appeared in television dramas, including a recurring role on Touched by an Angel, a series that centered on moral reckoning and redemption. A perfect role for the stoicism and strength Miss Angelou had become a national symbol for. Film followed as well. In 1998, she directed Down in the Delta, starring Alfre Woodard and Wesley Snipes. The story traced a family from Chicago on a journey to reconnect with Southern roots, a terrain not completely unfamiliar to Angelou. Directing required a multitude of different disciplines than writing did. It demanded orchestration and pacing beyond language. The project did not dominate box offices, but it once again demonstrated her continued refusal to remain in one creative lane. Through all of this, Miss Angelou continued publishing poetry, and Still I Rise, though earlier, gained renewed cultural traction during this period. The title poem in particular became shorthand for perseverance. Its refrain entered speeches, classrooms, protest signs. Angelou's lines were quoted by people who had never read a full volume of her work. Recognition accumulated steadily through awards, honorary degrees, and invitations to speak at national gatherings. She received over 50 honorary doctorates across her lifetime, yet rarely lingered on ceremony. Public praise did not seem to alter her cadence. Parallel to her visibility was her life at Wake Forest University. When Miss Angelou accepted the Reynolds Professorship in 1981, she did not conform to traditional academic patterns. She did not assign heavy syllabi or hide behind institutional jargon. Students described her classroom as intimate and direct, with an emphasis on responsibility, discipline, and self-knowledge. She often told her students that language is power and therefore obligation. Although there were no theatrics in her lectures, she expected attentiveness and offered honesty in return. Young writers who approached Miss Angelou for advice were often met first with questions. What are you willing to give to the work? What are you prepared to confront? Her mentorship did not align with indulgence or complacency. Miss Angelou's home became an extension of this mentorship. Dinner tables extended to facilitate group discussions. Visiting artists were welcomed. Former students returned years later still calling her Dr. Angelou, regardless of the honorary nature of the title. Her son Guy remained close. Their relationship matured once again into something reciprocal. He advised her in certain professional matters. She offered counsel in return. Their early years of instability had given way to mutual respect and a special kind of closeness. He would later speak publicly about her steadiness at home, her routines, her expectations, the way she insisted on courtesy even in private moments. Public stature had not replaced her domestic habits. In January 1993, Maya Angelou stood on the steps of the United States Capitol at the invitation of Bill Clinton. The occasion was his first presidential inauguration. The temperature was cold, the crowd immense, the political symbolism unmistaken. It had been more than 3 decades since a poet had read at an inauguration, the last being Robert Frost for John F. Kennedy. Angelou read a poem she had written for the moment, On the Pulse of Morning. The text did not rehearse partisan language. Instead, it traced the geography of the American landscape, rock, river, tree, inviting the nation to imagine itself differently. Her delivery, of course, was measured, unhurried, and each syllable given space. The broadcast carried her voice across the country and beyond. For many watching, this was not their first encounter with her work, but it was their most public one. The poem later won a Grammy Award for Best Spoken Word Album. It also secured something less quantifiable, a position in national memory. From that point forward, she was not only a celebrated author or professor, she was a ceremonial presence, someone called upon at moments of collective pause. Throughout the 90s and into the 2000s, she continued to publish poetry and essays, including collections such as Phenomenal Woman, and later volumes that revisited themes of endurance, love, and self-definition. Lines from her poems circulated independently of their original context, quoted in speeches, printed on posters, shared at graduations and memorials. Some critics argued that her later work leaned towards affirmation than formal experimentation. Angelou did not contest the shift. She wrote towards clarity rather than obscurity, towards accessibility rather than academic distance. Her public appearances multiplied. She delivered public addresses across the country, often returning to the same ideas: dignity, responsibility, and courage, but adjusting the language to the audience before her. She appeared in documentaries, interviews, and cultural retrospectives, her memory always precise and her humour intact. The cadence that had once been honed in silence and sharpened on stage now moved easily through microphones and auditoriums. At Wake University, Miss Angelou continued teaching well into her later years. She was known to begin sessions without notes, speaking for long stretches from memory, weaving literature with personal reflection. She insisted on punctuality and preparation, not as a rigid discipline, but as respect for language itself. Many who passed through her courses would later recall a feeling of being asked to account for themselves, to think carefully about who they intended to become. In 2011, Miss Angelou would receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Barack Obama. The medal, awarded at the White House, recognized not a single book or speech, but the arc of a life. By that point, Maya Angelou had received more than 50 honorary degrees, dozens of literary awards, and national decorations that spanned political administrations. Yet, she often redirected praise towards teachers, elders, and community members who had shaped her long before institutions had taken notice. In the 2000s, she gradually reduced travel, though invitations did not slow. Health required adjustments. The physical demands of constant movement were no longer sustainable. She wrote from home more frequently, and hosted fewer visitors. She also spent longer stretches in reflection. Interviews from this period reveal a woman less interested in recounting achievement than in discussing gratitude and discipline. On the 28th of May 2014, Maya Angelou died at her home in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, at the age of 86. News of her death traveled quickly. Tributes arrived from presidents, artists, students, activists, and readers who had never met her but felt addressed by her work. Public statements described her as a poet, a civil rights activist, a memoirist, a teacher. The list of titles were always long, though none fully contained her. Her funeral at Wake University drew national attention. Former President Clinton spoke. First Lady Michelle Obama sent remarks. The ceremony reflected the breadth of her reach. Political leaders, alongside former students, musicians, and artists beside academics. In the years since her death, her words continue to circulate. Still I Rise is invoked in protest movements. Phenomenal Woman appears in classrooms and social media captions alike. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings remains on school syllabus. Maya Angelou's life resists reduction to a single narrative. She moved between disciplines like a landscape of water capillaries. She inhabited activism, artistry, academia, and media without allowing one to eclipse the other. The girl who once chose silence became a national voice, not through volume, but through consistency. Across decades, marked by political rupture and cultural transformation, she maintained a commitment to language as responsibility. Not ornament, not weapon, but responsibility. Thank you for listening to Sleepy Archives. If you're still awake, please consider dropping us a like and or rating on whatever platform you're listening on.